This is Alive, your voice, your future town hall roundtable, free speech in America. Good evening to you. I'm Jonathan Elias. Thanks for being with us this evening. That'll be the focus of our discussion tonight. What has happened to free speech in America? First, though, let's start with some headlines and some big ones. A lot of eyes paying attention to what's happening in the Southeast. Florida, Georgia, South Carolina still recovering from Hurricane Irma. Most of the homes on the Keys damaged, and historic storm surge flooding in Jacksonville still a huge problem tonight. Power for many won't be restored for maybe another week and a half. The heat with no air conditioning has proven deadly for some of the elderly and sick. The president tweeted today that he will be going to Florida tomorrow. But before that, for a second straight night, the president now is hosting a White House dinner for congressional Democrats. This time, minority leaders Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. This is just 1 week after reaching a short-term deal on the debt limit and federal funding. The three will reportedly talk DACA and health care. And also on the president's desk right now, a resolution condemning the violence in Charlottesville as an act of domestic terror. And it does single out white nationalists, white supremacists, the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, and other hate groups. Freedom of speech was thrust into the spotlight during the Unite the Right rally to keep a Confederate statue in the heart of the Virginia town. The rally and counter-protests resulted in deadly chaos. And as we kick off this roundtable discussion on free speech, we're going to start with a watershed moment in the debate over American rights to express their opinions and beliefs. Our Jeff Goldberg takes us to Charlottesville, Virginia, 1 month ago.
It began the night of Friday, August 11th, with white nationalists marching on Charlottesville, torches in hand. The next day, the Unite the Right rally resulted in a series of violent clashes, leading to the moment when police say James Fields Jr. deliberately drove his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer.
A tragic thing happened yesterday, and we really need to rise up against that.
A nation was now on edge, with many Americans deeply concerned about the reemergence of a white supremacist movement of hate and intolerance. President Trump, meanwhile, further angering those hoping to hear words of comfort and condemnation.
You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent.
The events of the week reignited a nationwide debate about Confederate statues, as well as schools and roads bearing the names of Confederate heroes.
If you start taking them down, where do you stop?
Maybe it could be replaced with something that is a little bit more inspirational.
In Baltimore, the city took them down. In Durham, North Carolina, protesters brought one down on their own. But in many cities throughout the South, the structures still stand. And just last week, a march to Washington against white supremacy and racism. Symbolically, their journey started where tensions first erupted weeks before, the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville.
We believe in freedom, and we will not stop until it's won.
What victory looks like on these issues is a question that many Americans are still trying to answer for themselves. In Washington, I'm Jeff Goldberg reporting.
With that said, just yesterday, new video from Porterville, California. Somebody threatening to pull a gun and shoot a man wearing an anti-President Trump t-shirt. In fact, he was caught on surveillance camera reaching into his waistband, hand on a gun, but he never pointed it or opened fire. But he's still facing criminal charges for the act. And we just heard from Charlottesville, site of those violent protests on campus. No stranger to that at all is the campus of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. That's where talks by Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter canceled because of violence that erupted, or at least the threat of protest. Alex Leinert now is in Berkeley tonight. And Alex, you know, the campus is gearing up for more controversial visits, but at least will these folks be able to speak, or will they be canceled like we've seen the other speeches that were?
Well, if things go as planned, Jonathan, they will be able to speak. They're gearing up for that, as you said, right now. I'm standing in Sproul Plaza, which has been the hub of free speech at Berkeley since it began in the early 60s. Now, this is where a lot of those protests have taken place for those speakers that have been set to come on campus. And with upcoming speech for tomorrow by Ben Shapiro, again, a lot of people out here spreading the word both for and against. Of the students that we talked to today about this climate of free speech on campus, a lot of them have said that they want there to be more balance between this idea of freedom of speech, but also of freedom to assemble.
Throughout history, we see that freedom of speech oftentimes isn't the most equitable of speech. Some voices are louder, and that is politics.
But they believe they have a right to shut down different opinions. because of this vague idea of hate speech. So it's very difficult being conservative on campus because any belief you have is considered hate speech.
I think that there's just a precedent that people who are on the far left have plenty of spaces as is, and that is a rhetoric that is strong on this campus. So they would just it wouldn't be a threat to the presence of left speech on campus to shut down buildings.
If your message is strong enough, no matter what side of the aisle it is, far left, far right, you shouldn't need violence to spread your message if it really is that strong.
And again, with a lot of students out here getting ready for this Ben Shapiro visit tomorrow, we spoke with the vice president of the Berkeley College Republicans, who says he's inviting people from some of these leftist organizations to come out and have a debate at this speech, which is still set to go on if all things go according to plan at Zellerbach Hall, which is actually right in front of me, so very close to this hub of free speech. Again, a lot of police on campus gearing up for this speech tomorrow. Jonathan?
Alex, the campus there and the UC system as a whole took a lot of criticism in light of the lack of security for the Yiannopoulos affair, because that just turned into an all-out riot and the police almost looked like they were just sitting back. They have their own police department. This shouldn't be a tall order to have anybody come and speak on campus, whether they're on the left side or the right side of the aisle.
And that's what we're hearing from a lot of students here, is there needs to be more emphasis on the security so that they can have these speeches, yet also allow some of these students to exercise their right to protest without this fear that violence is going to erupt in a chaotic manner that's going unenforced with the law enforcement on campus.
All right, Alex Lehnert out there for us in Berkeley. We appreciate you taking the time. Now let's talk about our panel. Let's introduce you to them. Joining us right here, Antonia Okafor. She's a new member of our Sinclair team. She's a political commentator, CEO of the #Empowered Movement. Former Maryland delegate Jolene Ivey, seen you before, she's wonderful to include, and Towson State University professor Richard Vatz, and former Maryland Congresswoman Donna Edwards. A welcome to all of you. And I guess we can just start this off by saying, where does free speech in America stand today? In a good place or in a bad place? Go ahead and start us off.
Well, thank you so much. I believe that free speech in America today, unfortunately, is at a turning point. It could go one way or the other. What we're seeing at UC Berkeley, on college campuses in general, all over the nation, is not boding well for the future of free speech in general. So I think this is a turning point for people to make a decision of if we're going to have free speech as if our founding fathers intended it, or if we're going to have it in a different way for the future.
Jolene?
I feel like it's just a reboot, that it gives us a chance to talk about it and perhaps rethink what's going on. I mean, I really do believe that college campuses are supposed to be a place where you have a free exchange of ideas. So I'm hoping that we can get back to that, but in the meanwhile...
But we're not there.
We're not there right now, but we will be.
Well, I don't think there's a lot of free speech on campuses, and I'll talk a little later about how conservatives are silenced in the academy. But also, the Supreme Court has limited free speech in terms of time, place, and manner, and that's understandable and reasonable. So we can't have completely free speech. And of course, free speech allows you to express your opinion without being put in jail. It doesn't allow you to criticize your employer without any consequences. So people also have to have the right idea about what free speech actually is. Free speech is not the right to express whatever you wish to express with no consequences whatsoever.
Yeah, but at the same time, we've gotten to a place where violence seems to have taken over for the lack of being able to have normal discourse. I mean, and I'm not sure if this is coming from the political spectrum or this is just coming from an ignorant spectrum. I don't know where it's coming from, but people should be able to have discourse without it turning into throwing punches, wearing masks, and beating each other over the head with bats.
Well, the reason you have violence is because most people don't believe in free speech. They believe in the concept. In other words, if you did a survey and asked people, do you believe in free speech, you'd probably get 80% or 90% to say yes. But when it comes to the actual operationalization of free speech, they don't believe that people who have opinions with which they differ should have the right to express these opinions freely. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's why we have violence, because a lot of people don't believe, particularly on college campuses, that you ought to be able to express opinions that they find terrible.
Ms. Edwards?
I think the First Amendment is alive and well. I do think that we are challenged on college campuses and we're challenged in our political environment. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we have so much media coming at us. But when I think about college campuses like Berkeley, like Wake Forest University, where I went to school, I'd have to make a decision today about whether I want to be inside listening and making an assessment, or whether I want to be outside protesting. Both of those are equally protected speech.
The problem that's come up so much, especially because I had a college kid, and she was taking a chemistry class, and somebody was sharing their political view, an instructor, which incensed me. I'm not paying a gazillion dollars to send my kid to campus, especially when it comes to chemistry. You know, just teach my child about what they're going to need to know in the world of medicine to make our lives better. But by doing that, you're kind of sprinkling in your own politics, which I think, shouldn't we all have a problem with, or am I way off base?
But hasn't that always been true? I mean, this is not a new phenomenon.
It's gotten so much worse.
No, but I think that we have to raise adult young people who understand how to do their own analysis and assessment, and how to challenge those values that they don't necessarily share. And so, to me, this is about you know, figuring out a way that that we can teach young people and teach ourselves as adults ways to challenge systems.
Let me play devil's advocate, but there's a way to teach, and there's a fine line between teaching and indoctrinating. I don't think that our kids are served well if they're indoctrinated.
On college campuses, it is either explicit or implicit that you are not to teach areas that constitute a category error. In other words, if I am teaching dance, I'm not supposed to be teaching politics.
Correct.
And so, in fact, if there is a complaint, I mean, obviously this has to be activated by a complaint, but if there is a complaint, a professor will not be free at most universities to teach that which is not inherent in the subject in which he or she is teaching.
But let's be honest too. Students, how many students have the backbone and the temerity to stand up against a professor at the risk of failing a class?
Absolutely not. They believe that this authority figure that they believe is supposed to tell them the facts and nothing else is telling them what is true, and that's the problem. Is because they've seen these people, they've seen authority figures, whether it's a professor or a teacher when they were in primary and secondary school, tell them this is what history is, for example, if they're a history professor, and then when they put in their own opinions into it and say, they don't put a disclaimer saying, no, this is not fact, or this is not, or this is a fact, or this is not opinion, that's the problem. Also, really the problem is shutting down someone else's opinion in the classroom. That's what we're seeing with administrators, is we're seeing these people who are not allowing students to become adults in these areas. UC Berkeley just a couple days ago said that they're going to have a way for them to have free counseling for the Ben Shapiro announcement, whether they're going to have coming up soon. So that's the problem with all of this.
You know, the interesting context or perspective for me is just this week I interviewed a 95-year-old veteran of World War II, and he just received his Purple Heart now. He was in a B-17 in a bomber. He signed up when he was 19 years old, and he's off fighting a war that, had they lost that war, this would not be the United States of America. And he just, and he's as sharp as a tack, and he said, what's happened to the kids these days? When I was growing up, we were sent off to fight a war, and the responsibilities that we were bridled with were heavy. He said now, he goes, I get a sense these kids aren't doing anything except complaining about a system that they don't want to fix, they'd rather break.
It does seem like we might be raising hothouse flowers instead of young adults, and that's something that we should all pay more attention to.
And that's not a left-right issue. This is just right down the middle of the road.
Well, it is the trophy generation. I mean, we've awarded them all trophies, and we've told them all that that they're all so fantastic. And I think that we have to get back to a point where we're allowing young adults to grow up, to question, to challenge, and that's okay. And I think that college, university campuses ought to be those kind of places. And as I said, I think students have an important decision to make. Do you go inside, or do you stay outside protesting? Both of those activities have values, and the college or university has to set the context under which that can take place.
Let's be clear here, though. It's not just college campuses. I feel like we're focusing a lot on college campuses. If there's just kind of this, microcosm. No, it's going off, completely out of the college campus realm here. So we're seeing that a lot also with what we're seeing in politics today as well.
Let's not be so quick to celebrate the greatest generation and the free speech that we believe inhered in that era. Because you have to remember that was also an era in which Catholics and Jews couldn't go to certain schools, in which African Americans were kept away from higher education in general. And
they also served in the military as well.
Exactly. And when such groups tried to articulate their points of view, they were shouted down. Not literally shouted down, but they were not allowed. So let's not look back at those years as great eras of freedom of speech, because they weren't. They may have been less violent eras because there was such a consensus in the United States, but they were certainly not eras in which freedom of speech flourished.
Let's put this on hold just for a second. We have to hold off on the discussion just because I want to do this. As we look now at the White House, we have noticed a dwindling of the daily press briefings. For a while, that was done just via audio only. Remember when they shut off the cameras? For a little perspective from inside the White House, let's turn now to a former Trump White House strategist, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. And Sebastian, you know, you weren't a part of the communications teams, but you would still speak on the administration's behalf. Describe for us what it was like going through the channels to make sure that your network interviews were lined up, and more importantly, you were able to say what you needed to say.
Well, I don't give away all the internal baseball, but we had a great team that were running the bookings for all of the official White House surrogates. And then we'd get requests coming in. They'd check, the bookers would check, what is today's policy on X issue? Do we have a stance? Is a stance developing? If we said yes, then I'd be provided with talking points, but there was no requirement for me to stick to them religiously. I never got in trouble for adding my own interpretation into the mix. So that's how it worked when I was in the White House, and it was a lot of fun.
Can you add some perspective to the conversation of free speech? Because so many people at home are trying to kind of get the right words or put their hands around the topic. They know it bothers them. Some people just can't articulate what it is that does bother them. But it seems that we've gotten to a place, and I guess you're keenly aware of this, that if you don't agree with one side or the other, then you have no being. You can't even speak up. And then it turns ugly fast. What happened?
Two things, Jonathan, and I really strenuously disagree with the guest that spoke last. The idea that, you know, you besmirch the greatest generation because we had systemic issues back home. These were the GIs, these were the men that went into theater to die for our rights, for freedom of speech. So to say that generation isn't deserving of our respect is outrageous. The fact is today, think just two things. We have freedom of speech zones inside colleges. As far as I'm concerned, the freedom of speech zone in America begins at the Atlantic shore and ends at the Pacific shore. That's what America is. The idea that, isn't it interesting? Why is it only the Milo Yiannopoulos, the Charles Murrays, the Ben Shapiros who are threatened with violence? Why aren't left-wing speakers not told by Berkeley, well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to charge you $20,000 for your security? Things are out of control, and one side of the political debate is attacking freedom of speech. If you don't agree with them, you're the problem. That's not how it works in America.
Well, let me ask you this. Where did that start?
Oh, you know where it started, really? In 1968, when the hardcore radicals here in America failed to have their revolution. They saw what was happening in France, in the streets of Paris. We had the failed Days of Rage here in Chicago. The SDS failed. So what happened? What did Bernardine Dawn, what did Billez do? They said, okay, what did Lenin say? Give me their children and I'll have their future. So they became high school teachers. They became tenured professors at Chicago. The radicals said, we're going to capture the institutions, and that's how you get to Snowflake City today. I'm familiar with a Northeastern university where it's a prestigious university, but how is it that the red MAGA hats, the Make America Great Again hats, were only worn after the election? After the election, those young girls, those young boys felt safe, felt it was okay to express their opinion. Before the election, nobody wore them. That's not good for democracy in America, Jonathan.
Sebastian, while I've got you here, let me just pivot a little bit and ask you a question that has to do with policy when it comes to what's happening in Afghanistan. Our men and women have been over there for 16 years fighting. They have been, when they initially went out there, we had over 60 terrorist camps that were up and operational. Last check, that they're all gone. It would seem that mission is accomplished. Why are we staying in Afghanistan, given that we have the technology of satellites and drones where we can monitor what's happening in that country if we weren't there?
Two things, one negative, one positive. The negative one, and I experienced this in spades inside the White House, that the last 16 years, Bush and Obama era policies have a massive inertia. There's this business as usual attitude that comes out of the bureaucracy. The swamp isn't just Capitol Hill. The swamp are a lot of bureaucrats who think, I've been here 20 years at the State Department, at the Pentagon, I know better than the president, I know better than his cabinet. So there's a lot of that, well, let's just carry on carrying on. That's the negative. The positive, why is the mission still there? We haven't won against the global jihadis. Think about this shocking thing. You can see this online. You can check these videos out. There are local Afghan warlords who have sworn allegiance to ISIS and have schools for kids to train them in jihad. Now that's Afghanistan. ISIS is in Syria. ISIS is in Iraq. But they are now expanding their franchise into South Asia. So there is still a job to be done, but this president will get it done.
All right, Sebastian Gorka, we appreciate you taking the time and joining our panel tonight.
Thanks.
Coming up for us, more of our discussion on freedom of speech here in America. In fact, we're going to pay a visit to Gettysburg, home of one of the nation's most famous Civil War battlefields. Non-stop coverage does continue streaming online with a behind-the-scenes look at Berkeley's security measures in place.
Building closures, parking restrictions, and a closed perimeter. Those are among the security precautions being taken by UC Berkeley police for Ben Shapiro's speaking event this Thursday here at Zellerbach Hall. The UC is taking what some might call extreme security measures in an effort to prevent violent protesters from disrupting Shapiro's appearance like they did earlier this year when Milo Yiannopoulos was scheduled to speak on campus.
Well, we're hoping our event can actually go through, unlike our previous events.
Troy Worden is president of the Berkeley College Republicans, the group that invited Shapiro to speak at Cal.
Well, we've been working with the university and the university police department around the clock to make sure this event is peaceful, successful, and safe for the attendees. Roads adjacent to the university are going to be shut down. The area around Zellerbach Hall, which is where we're hosting the event, is going to be cleared. Only ticket holders will be able to get into that area.
We have a right to protest too.
Rafael Cardis of RefuseFascism.org says keeping the protesters at such a far distance from the event infringes on their right to free speech.
The chancellor of this university is using that to create a huge police state, almost martial law conditions on this campus. It is outrageous. You know, we need more protests, not police state intimidation.
Ben Shapiro's speech is scheduled for this Thursday at 7 p.m. Cardis says at around that same time, he'll be taking part in a counter event outside, but as close as he can to Ben Shapiro.
And we will be out here doing a People Speak Out against white supremacy.
People have the chance to protest before and after the event and during the event. We have to balance our First Amendment rights with concern for safety. And so I think it's reasonable the measurements the university police department is taking to ensure that no one is hurt.
Looking back on history now to the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in that war. That field remains one of the most important pieces of history, with reenactments and monuments to the men who lost their lives, even fighting for the Confederacy. Ashley Honey, now from our sister station WHP, is there tonight on the very field where General Lee ordered Pickett with his final charge to rush the hill, and he failed. Ashley?
Jonathan, good evening. Yeah, and a lot of people know that Pickett's charge, one of General Lee's last commands, was a defining point in the Civil War where the Union overtook the Confederate Army and just went on from there. Now, here around Gettysburg, there's over 1,300 memorials dedicated to the Civil War. Of course, many are dedicated to the Confederacy, but it raises the question here, are these monuments and reenactments a part of history despite the hateful messages that they may send? And where do they stand in those colliding realms of correctness and free speech?
The vision of America they had, the cause that they fought for, was a cause that centered around enslaving black people. And there's just no getting around that.
Scott Hancock, a historian with Gettysburg College, says Confederate Civil War monuments can serve as teachable moments if they're correct, stating many monuments claim the battle was fought for states' rights, not slavery, and that's where the conflict begins.
Those monuments are telling a lie. They're repeating a perverted, twisted version of history that began by Southern apologists soon after the war, before the war even ended.
Our reaction to the monument thing is history is history. You can pull down the monuments, but that will not erase history.
James Zartman's great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, and Zartman himself has been portraying a Union soldier in Gettysburg reenactments for over 10 years, saying despite increasing racial tensions over the years, the area doesn't see much protest.
I think it's because it's hallowed ground.
ground where over 50,000 soldiers on both sides gave their lives for what they believed in, and that protesting these monuments or fields would be disrespectful.
Be like making an uproar in church.
But in recent times of great conflict, Gettysburg seems to be the perfect breeding ground for questions surrounding the necessity of Confederate monuments and where they fall in terms of free speech.
If we don't learn from it, then, you know, as the saying goes, we're doomed to repeat it.
Everyone seems to be, not everyone, but they seem to be so offensive over history. I mean, where does it end?
And while Scott Hancock understands most monuments truthfully dictate a bumpy path that made the U.S. the nation we are today, it's educating people of the truth of what happened that will move us forward.
You know, that if we don't understand why these Confederate monuments went up and what they have signified for such a long time, then we're not really going to be able to address the problems we have with race and racial inequity and a host of other things in any effective way.
And so, Jonathan, I'm standing here in the National Historic Site of Gettysburg, where there's 11 monuments dedicated to states who fought in the war. Interestingly enough, 8 of those monuments were erected in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, that's way after the Civil War ever took place and even ended. Behind me here is the monument to the state of Virginia. And you can see poised on top of the monument, that is General Robert E. Lee on top of a bronze horse. And just below him are several bronze figurines depicting the artillery, cavalry, and infantry of the Confederate Army. This statue was actually put up in 1918, so just early 1900s. Robert E. Lee here is actually facing the field where Pickett's charge took place, his last command before being defeated by the Union Army in July 3rd, 1863. Jonathan?
Actually, let me ask you this. I know that they put on a lot of reenactments out there especially, but I understand some protests were going on this summer. Kind of spell that out for me. What happened this summer? Were there a lot of protests? Did they shut down a lot of those reenactments?
Well, so none were actually shut down. You know, this summer was one of the anniversaries of the Civil War. So on July 1st through 3rd, they, of course, had reenactments scheduled. And so rumors were swirling around that the anarchist Antifa group was going to come out and burn Confederate flags and, you know, dig up some of the graves. However, there's actually no Confederate soldiers buried here that we know of. And so, of course, in response to those potential protests, some sons of Confederate veterans did gather here, but those protests by the Antifa never actually materialized. So, you know, it just turned out to be a peaceful little gathering. And like I said, interestingly enough, you know, even though you would think Gettysburg would be such a breeding ground for controversy, considering this is one of the main battles where the Union and the Confederate armies confronted each other, it's remained fairly quiet over these past several years as these racial tensions, as you know, have been building across the country. Okay. Ashley Honia, we appreciate you taking the time. So we talked about college campuses and what's happened to free speech. Now let's talk about what's happened with Confederate statues and symbols and memorials. We've seen there has been sort of a growing tide of people that want to bring them down. They've torn them down in some cities, they've covered them up, they're going to remove them. Is this an issue of free speech, or is this just now what?
I think it's important to go back to what that man said, that history is history. Obviously, we don't want to talk about the egregious side of the Civil War. Obviously, the Confederacy and the side with slavery was absolutely something that we don't want to tout or to celebrate. But that being history is history, and the fact that we don't want to make those same mistakes in the future. When we look at these statues, and we look at any type of basically memorabilia when it comes to what happened in the Civil War, it's showing a history. It's showing a history that we don't want to repeat. And when we're trying to take these symbols down, bad or good, it's going to be something that's going to affect the future generation, because they're not going to be able to look at these examples of what they should not be repeating. And so with this, I think part of it too is what he said when it comes to taking down these statues, to say that it's going to inhibit racial equality or progress by having them there. I don't think that these statues, I mean, you know, me as an African-American woman growing up in Dallas, Texas, and then seeing those statues in Confederate memorabilia, it did not in any way inhibit me from progressing, from being the person that I was meant to be. And so I think that's a very dangerous message to continue to convey, that this is going to have any type of lasting impact on the African-American community as a whole.
But you know what? I'm also an African-American woman, and every day in the legislature in Annapolis, I would have to walk past the statue of Roger Taney. Now, he was the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision. When I realized who that was in front of my State House, I thought, all I have to do is bring it up to everybody, let them know. Hey, let me tell you who this is. And we would instantly take it down. That shows you how naive I was. It took a decade on my part, and of course, decades before me, of people working to get this thing down. And unfortunately, it took Charlottesville before it finally happened. But you have to understand what was the intent when that statue was put up. And in 1867, when the legislature voted to put it up, they had a discussion like you often do when you're discussing legislation, and one of the delegates stood up and said, well, we want to affirm that the Dred Scott decision was right and righteous and affirmed by the state of Maryland. Well, really? That's why it was put up. And there's no way that I think that that should stand in a place of honor in front of our State House, and I can say gladly that it is now gone, and I will actually thank Governor Hogan for that.
Ms. Edwards, do you think we should be going around rounding up all the Confederate memorabilia, the statues, the memorials?
Well, let's think about this. Many of those statues and memorials were actually put up in the Reconstruction era, in Jim Crow, as a way to say, in the face of black citizens, African Americans, we still are in charge. And so, yes, I think they should be taken down. Now, I think you're talking about something completely different when you're talking about the context of a Gettysburg historical park. I visited Vicksburg Memorial Park over the summer. And when I look at Vicksburg and I see it tells a complete story, Gettysburg tells a complete story. That's
so historically,
very different.
it's okay to have that.
That's very different from random memorials in the middle of a town.
But in your Capitol building, you had statues in your Capitol building.
I know, and I think that's very problematic. So, but states have a right to decide what monument goes into the statue goes into the Capitol building, and I think that they should reconsider that. I mean, we are a nation of, of over 330 million people, and we come from very diverse backgrounds, and our history should represent the full, complete picture of who we are. And these statues really do not. And the fact that they come down so easily because they were, mass-produced as the slap in the face, I think is evidence enough that it's time to remove those. It's 2017, and it's past time. And it's very different than going into a museum and studying history, or onto a battlefield or a battleground and studying history to get a complete picture of our history.
Representative Edwards, you just said yourself that this shows could show a complete representation of who America is, and unfortunately we have bad history. We have that. The bad and the ugly of it is part of our history.
But the random statues in the middle of towns I've driven through, I spent 3.5 months on the road driving through a lot of those southern towns, and those random statues were not put in place for the purpose of telling a complete story of history, and they need to be removed.
Yes, statues do not have a squatter's right to exist wherever they have been put, but we should keep them for historical value. We have to realize that people are made uncomfortable by having to walk past them. For example, if they go to a ball game or if they're just where they live, there's no argument for that. And I think that this is not strictly a matter of freedom of speech. This is a matter of judgment. And it probably is, by political judgment, you should not have people who were racist, people who were violently anti-Semitic, represented by statues where the general population lives, but they should be in museums. I wouldn't be very happy if there were a statue of Himmler everywhere I went, but on the other hand, I'd want to see a statue of the guy in a museum.
Well, in fact, in Germany, you can't do a Sieg Heil, you cannot have a swastika. I mean, after the war, they made it very clear that you go to prison for those kinds of things.
And absolutely, and with Germany as an example as well, with the anti-free speech laws that they passed, now we're seeing a lot of people, a rise of people who are deniers, of Holocaust deniers, because they don't see the history. It's not that we don't condemn the bad parts of our history. It's that we have to show it to people. And I definitely reject basically a projection that because as an African-American person, I walk through a park or whatever, and I see a statue, and I'm automatically offended. I don't think that we can project that narrative on every single person, every individual. It doesn't come down to that. It comes down to the person. We should let them make that decision for themselves if they can see that as something.
In Germany, with their history of having executed 10 million Jews, gypsies, mentally ill, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it makes sense that they would have kind of a reaction formation. In other words, to simply say, we will not allow certain speech in this area. So I think the history of a country can tell you about whether it's reasonable to have restrictions on freedom of speech.
So this is just, you think, common sense or judgment as opposed to free speech?
I believe so, yes.
But I think it's also important when we start talking about statues and history, where are all the enslaved people who built this country? Where are their statues? Where are all the people of color who had a real impact on who this country is today? Where are their statues?
Then why are we fighting for that? Why are they outraged that we have more of that as part of a complete picture? That is
not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is you can't take down history. It's going to kill history.
These are about celebrating people who enslaved other people, people who attempted to destroy the Union that we're celebrating. And so that's really something very, very different. And again, I think, you know, the importance of, you know, a protester being able to protest and you know, carry their Confederate flag and their Nazi flag if they want, go ahead, because I want to be the one on the other side organizing the counter-protest.
I'm going to push pause just for a second. We have to put the discussion on hold. We're going to take you inside the Congressional Media Fairness Caucus. It does exist, so just what are its goals? We have nonstop coverage continuing online. Our national correspondent, Christine Frizzell, with a look at paid speech on the campaign trail, questionable donations. We're back right after this.
It's one of the most common ways to make a transaction in a store or online. Enter your credit card number, your address, security code, and that's it. But when making political donations, sometimes no address is required.
The rules we have for campaign finance were really set up in the 1960s before you had online credit card donations.
Peter Schweitzer is president of the Government Accountability Institute, which found 44% of members of Congress don't require online donors to enter a security code either.
If you don't have credit card fraud detection, those donations will go undisclosed and undetected.
He says not only can people donate more than the limits, they can also be from countries outside of the United States.
The Federal Election Commission makes it very clear, making any foreign donation to any federal, state, district, or local political party or organization is against the law. But people have still found a way to donate, which raises the question about what they're getting in return.
If the American people are going to have any confidence in the people they send to Washington, they need to know who is supporting those people.
North Carolina Congressman Walter Jones is one of the 37 co-sponsors of the bill, called the Stop Foreign Donations Affecting Our Elections Act, which has the support of Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate.
The influence of money is greater today on policy than it's ever been, particularly with this Russian investigation. These bills in the Senate and House are more needed today than ever before.
In Washington, I'm Christine Frizzell reporting.
You know, these days it seems that the media comes under almost as much scrutiny as those that they're covering, the politicians. And some on Capitol Hill now are fighting back because they believe even the bills that they propose do not get fair analysis and that voters are intentionally misled. What are they doing about it? Our chief political correspondent, Scott Thuman, takes a closer look.
There's no shortage of talk these days, but is there enough trust?
I can't help but think there are politics involved because you can change the various channels and get different views.
As for allegations of media bias,
any criticism, they need to look into it and see if it is justified or not.
Out of the way. Some politicians go a step further. In fact, there's even a media fairness caucus on Capitol Hill, chaired by Republican Lamar Smith.
The media bias is the elephant in the room that a lot of Republicans are ignoring.
He insists he doesn't want censorship, just accountability, and encourages his colleagues to cite any bias in speeches and on social media.
Republicans are not getting their message out because the American people are only hearing one side.
The president has long said that's why he goes around the newspapers and TV cameras, speaking directly and unfiltered to the American people via Twitter. But there are plenty of others who believe that that vilification of the media is actually dangerous.
But I think this notion of fake news, which is being fueled by the president and by some others, is a false construct.
Congressman Dan Kildee argues media companies may have their own perspective, and that does challenge the public to choose sources wisely. But all of this criticism damages not just the industry, but to some degree, democracy.
If you dissect what the president says, it is don't listen to my cabinet, don't listen to the news media, don't listen to your senators or your members of Congress, just listen to me. A frightening position for a public leader to take.
On Capitol Hill, I'm Scott Thuman.
With that said, let's get right to the panel on this one, because it was President Trump that came out and said fake news. And as many journalists, and as one myself, you take offense to hearing that, because that's a pretty broad brush. You can take issue with a reporter or a group of reporters that may have, misquoted you or said something that wasn't accurate, and they've gone back and said, we're sorry. But that's a pretty broad brush to stroke, and he seems to have his way with his free speech with his Twitter account.
Well, let me say that the network coverage of President Trump has been unlike any coverage of any president I've ever seen. Let me tell you about one particular individual whom I used to admire, Wolf Blitzer. He would describe in news conversations Trump's statements as outrageous. Now, that is not the job of a journalist. A journalist may say controversial, may say that President Trump has made controversial remarks. He should not be saying President Trump has made outrageous remarks. And he uses comments like that consistently. They're also used on NBC, MSNBC, CBS. So this complaint about Trump's communication has to be balanced with the fact that he is treated differently by media which consider themselves part of the resistance that has never happened before in American history.
Is that fair, do you think?
I think that he got away with way more than he should have during the campaign and even today. I mean, any bounce back we've had since then has just been a reset of journalists becoming journalists again. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I mean, as a politician, I mean, you get things written and said about you all the time, and you try to punch back. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that we are in a very precarious situation where, if you have the President of the United States calling the media fake news, then it calls into question everything that we know that's part of our democracy and our republic. And so that really concerns me. I don't have a problem with the president having a direct line to ordinary
millions
Americans,
of people, right?
to millions of people. I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with his judgment in terms of what it is that he tweets and he says. And I don't think the answer to that is to challenge the integrity of the media unless there's a point where their integrity needs to be challenged.
Well, there have been many times, though, when he has challenged, for example, like CNN, and many people, including the media side, will kind of say the same thing, that he's kind of putting this broad stroke on them. But then you find out later, like with Project Veritas, when they find out that CNN is actually talking about these issues to get ratings instead of actually reporting facts. I think that's the problem people see. And I think the people who voted for Trump, that was an issue for them a long time ago. And President Trump was their answer to that.
Criticizing the media and criticizing the president are not mutually exclusive. The president indeed has been irresponsible. But if you look at the journalistic coverage on CNN, for example, when they have panel after panel after panel with one conservative and 4 or 5 liberals, and they do this consistently, and their presumption is always that the president has done something wrong. Let's discuss how wrong he's been.
Well, and the interesting part about those debates, when you watch them, and I think this is what's happening, is if you have this lone conservative that voices their opinion, they're laughed and scoffed at as though what they had to say had no merit or no weight.
But let's not conflate what is sort of entertainment in the evening on the cable news networks
that's not what it's
with
being
journalism.
sold as. That's supposed to be journalism.
Okay, and so, but I mean, the president has not only said that the network and the cable news are fake, electronic news are fake news. He's also said that about the print press, and I think that there's a real danger in that. And one day, you know, the president's going to decide, you know what, I need the press on my side to sell an issue, to give out hurricane information. We don't want the American public to believe that what the media is putting out is fake news under those circumstances.
And a free press is the foundation of our country. I mean, come on. I have my master's in journalism. I was a journalist early in my career. I'm not today. But I have so much respect for the press. And I have to say that we're only talking about CNN. Has anyone brought up Fox? I mean, they have been extremely right-wing, and I believe often unfair. I have, in fact, been on the local Fox channel and been the only Democrat in a panel of many Republicans. So they're not being balanced.
It does swing both. I mean, here's the problem. When I got into journalism, it was supposed to, the big word that the banner we flew in the battlefield was objective. You know, my job is not to take a position left or right. Mine is just to present to the court of public opinion and let you decide. I don't need to add adjectives to something, just to tell you what somebody said. And oftentimes, let's just be honest, President Trump, while he's no Winston Churchill as far as being an eloquent speaker, he tries to make a statement and it ends up hurting him more than it helps him.
But
you
that's
don't need to
without
add anything to
journalists
something
saying
like
anything,
that.
yeah.
And I don't think we have any responsibility to ensure the public views the media in a particular way. If the public views the media negatively, it may be partially because of the president, which is just fine, that's part of his persuasive apparatus, but it also may be because they're not really doing their job. Listen, the media are composed of tremendously intelligent people. In Fox, in CNN, MSNBC, they're all intelligent people. But their biases and their one-sided presentations of issues, and they're focusing on certain issues and not other issues, is a rhetorical reality. And to deny it, I think, just loses sight of the persuasive power of the media.
But here goes back to my original argument when we talked about when one side speaks. There's no more discourse. You can't just have a conversation with one side and the other side, just talking with each other, having a beer, and coming to not a consensus, but an agreement that's workable. That doesn't exist anymore, it seems.
The problem today, though, also is not just traditional media like we see with MSNBC, CNN, cable news, or
bloggers,
local news.
The internet.
Exactly, we have that, but we also have now, we have politics bleeding into sports, for example, like ESPN lately is kind of has some heat right now because of one of their commentators saying something that maybe they weren't talking about sports. Maybe they should have stuck to sports instead of talking about the president. But then again, that also goes into free speech. Where do we have to, on both sides, we have to look and stay accountable and say, where is it where we're going to draw the line when it comes to politics and talking about that, and then the news and free speech and the free press, where, yeah, we gather our facts and our information from those sources. I think that's the problem there, is that we don't know the line. The line is too blurred today in 2017.
But I think we should also be clear that free speech really just means Congress shall not make a law limiting speech. It doesn't mean that we can't say things that are disagreeable.
Absolutely, you can do that, but again, there has to be mutual respect.
But let me tell you,
and where we are now is no different.
Where would we find disinterested journalists? We used to think we had disinterested journalists, although, for example, Walter Cronkite was a member of the Democratic Party.
I got to stop it. We have to take a break. This is a part of what we have to do here. Let's put the conversation on hold for a second. Coming up next, we're going to go live to Columbia, South Carolina, because 2 years after the battle over the Confederate battle flag ended with its removal from the State House, you remember this moment? Non-stop coverage continues online as we go behind the headlines with Mark Hyman.
Hello, I'm Mark Hyman. As colleges begin the new academic year, they must contend with the new face of anti-Semitism. Here's what's happening behind the headlines. It's the same old anti-Semitism. It just masquerades as the BDS movement: boycott, divestment, and sanctions. BDS masks its anti-Semitism not by attacking Jews directly, but instead by attacking the spiritual center of Judaism, Israel. Criticism of Israel is protected speech. Even anti-Semitic speech is protected. But let's call it what it is: anti-Semitic. BDS claims to seek peace in the Middle East, but its toxic message singles out the only democracy in the region. It uses decades-old anti-Semitism tactics, delegitimizing, demonizing, and using double standards. The movement's call for the destruction of Israel is to delegitimize the Jewish state. BDS equates Zionism with apartheid and racism to demonize Israel. The greatest inversion of all time is to equate Zionism with Nazism. And the only atrocities it claims to see are in Israel, the double standard. The BDS movement probably views college campuses as an opportunity to grow and further its goals. It's active at some of the most elite progressive schools. Its call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions is the extension of the decades-old practice of isolating Jewish businesses. It's the same old anti-Semitism on a grander scale. To comment, go to BehindTheHeadlines.net. I'm Mark Hyman.
2015, Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, gunned down several members of a historically black church. Prior to that, he had been pictured with a Confederate battle flag. And after that, the debate over South Carolina's flying that flag at the State House came to the forefront. It was July 2015 that the debate ended and that flag was removed. Brian McConaughey, now from our sister station in Columbia, is there tonight. And Brian, at the time, this was a heated debate, even after that shooting at the church.
Jonathan, absolutely, it was a heated debate. This was a very volatile place to be for a lot of reasons. Naturally, you just pointed out the massacre that happened in Charleston during the summer of 2015. But on these very grounds where I was standing, there were some very, very fruitful discussions about the Confederate flag and what it stood for. On one side, you had the camp that said it stood for heritage, it stood for history. On the other side of the argument, you had a camp that said it stood for hate and was nothing but a symbol of oppression. Now, both brought certainly a valuable perspective to that discussion. And the key word there, though, is discussion. That is what happened here on these State House grounds for days and days following the Mother Emanuel shootings. The discussions were loud, the discussions were heated, but the one thing that never happened was there was never any violence. Nothing ever erupted into any violence, even the day that flag came down. Now, in response to the public outcry about the presence of that flag and its relation to Dylan Roof, the then governor, Nikki Haley, challenged lawmakers to remove the flag. It wasn't something as simple as just sending a maintenance worker out to the flagpole, cranking the crank, and then taking the flag down and sticking it in a box and bringing it to a museum. They had to take action. And to give you a little bit of history on how we got to where we are right now, in the year 2000, the General Assembly here in South Carolina passed something known as the Heritage Act. That removed the Confederate battle flag from the State House dome and moved it to a flagpole about 30 feet behind me, not far from where I'm standing now. Of course, the flag and the pole are now gone. To remove it, though, they needed a supermajority vote of both the House and the Senate to remove that flag from standing on those very grounds where we are right now. It now sits in a protective environment at the Confederate Relic Room here in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, that part of the discussion then has bled over into more recent events. Of course, after Charlottesville, there's been significant talk about the removal of Confederate monuments. There have been some lukewarm pushes here in Columbia and in various parts of the state to remove what are about 6 or 7 Confederate monuments here that, of course, monuments to General Robert E. Lee and a former Confederate governor here. The Heritage Act, though, also protects those monuments from permanent removal, and again would require a 2/3 vote by the General Assembly to have them permanently removed. And right now it would seem, while the session is not active, that that would not be happening anytime in the near future, Jonathan.
All right, Brian McConaughey, we appreciate you coming to us tonight from South Carolina. Thanks for that. Let's just finish up the discussion. We have a few more minutes before we go. I'm just curious where we go, because the First Amendment is very clear about free speech. You have the right to have your say, but you don't have the right to have, retaliation with violence. But at the same time, you don't have the right to run into a crowded theater and yell fire where people could get hurt or killed trampling you on their way out the door. There has to be some sort of level of responsibility that comes with the speech that you deliver, and there should be avenues for people to be able to hear both sides without the fear of retaliation or violence. Is that wrong, or?
Well, I think you're correct. I think from my own experience, one of the worst areas of freedom of speech is colleges and universities. the prejudice against conservatives in colleges and universities throughout the country, with exceptions. I mean, there's Hillsdale, there's Liberty, there are other examples. But the prejudice against conservatives is so virulent that, in fact, one finding by the Higher Education Research Institute was that in New England universities in social sciences and humanities, they very often had a 28-to-1 ratio of liberals to conservatives. Conservatives aren't hired. When they're hired, they aren't given tenure. When they're given tenure, they aren't allowed to be published. It is the prejudice against conservative thought and conservatives in higher education is really appalling.
Well, getting back to the First Amendment, I mean, I think the First Amendment is alive and well, and I want to see the hate on display so that I can stand on the other side and protest it. And that, to me, is the greatest challenge.
And some of the violence, though, is coming from both sides. I mean, it's left and right, and we've seen a lot of the left with the.
Don't call them the left, okay?
Well, but that's their name.
Well, I'm the left, and I haven't acted violently, and I still exercise my First Amendment.
But there's a lot of people
speech.
who stand on the right
and
that aren't trans members or white supremacists.
Is that our challenge is making sure that we have the things in place that make sure that people on either side of any debate are able to exercise their First Amendment rights and walk away safely.
I think the discourse that we just saw, it kind of shows where we are right now, where we're arguing against left and right. The problem is a lot of people don't know what that is anymore. We don't distinguish between the left, between liberal, between conservative, between really authoritarian, if I can speak today. And that's the problem. That's the dangerous part of this here, is that if we don't know where those lines are, then we're going to say Antifa is the same thing as the Democrats, when obviously Nancy Pelosi has said and denounced them. We're going to say that, you know, President Trump is a white supremacist, when obviously he's denounced them many times. We have to be careful in our wording when it comes to that, because we're putting these groups of people in places with people that they don't want to associate with.
Last comment.
You know, I'm really sorry that it takes something like Charlottesville to bring down a statue. I'm so sorry that it's got to take Dylan Roof to bring down a flag.
We got to wrap this up.
And I think it's time for us to start doing the right thing without the threat of violence.
What was nice tonight was we had a discussion, all sides got said, nobody got hurt. Thank you very much. My thanks to the panel, and thanks for joining us tonight.